Good morning, philosophers. I've got a hard limit of 15 minutes today because I got to get to some stuff done. So let's get into it. We are on letter LXXXXVII or whatever. Where was I? Oh, yes. There doesn't seem to be any difference now between your bath's warm and your bath's boiling. How primitive! Such is some people's verdict these days on Scipio because he did not have extensive areas of glass to let the daylight into the perspiring room, because it was not a habit with him to stew in strong sunlight, letting the time go by until he was perfectly cooked in his own bathroom. Quote, "What a sorry wretch of a man, he didn't know how to live. He'd take his bath in water that was never filtered, and often cloudy, practically muddy in fact, after any heavy rain," end quote. Well, it did not make much difference to Scipio if this was the kind of bath he had. He went there to wash off sweat, not scent. And what do you think some people will say to this? Quote, "Well, I don't envy Scipio. If that was the kind of bath he had all the time, it was a real exile's life that he was leading." Yes, and what's more, if you must know, he didn't even have a bath every day. Writers who have left us a record of life in ancient Rome tell us that it was just their arms and legs, which of course they dirtied working, that people washed every day, bathing all over only once a week on market day. Obviously, someone will comment, there must have been times when they were positively disgusting. And what do you think they stank of? I'll tell you, of soldiering, of hard work, of what makes up a man. Men are dirtier creatures now than they ever were in the days before the introduction of immaculate bathrooms. What is it Horace says when he wants to describe a man noted and indeed notorious for the inordinate lengths to which he carried personal fastidiousness? Quote, "Bacillus stinks of scented lozenges." Produce Bacillus today and he might just as well stink like a goat. He would be in the same position as the Gargonius with whom Horace contrasted him. For nowadays it is not even enough to use some scented ointment. It must be reapplied 2 or 3 times a day as a precaution against its evaporation on the person. I say nothing about the way people preen themselves on the perfume it carries as if it were their own. If all this strikes you as being excessively disapproving, you must put it down to the house's atmosphere. During my stay in it, I've learned from Aglialis, who's the present owner of the estate, and gives a great deal of attention to its management, that trees can be transplanted even when quite old, a lesson that we old men need to learn when we reckon that every one of us who puts down a new olive plantation is doing so for someone else's benefit. Now that I've seen him carefully transplanting one of a number of trees that had given fruit unstingingly over 3 and even 4 seasons. So you too can enjoy the shade of the tree which, quote, "is slow in coming up, is there to give your grandson's shade in later years long hence." End quote. According to our Virgil, who was not concerned with the facts but with poetic effect, his object being the pleasure of the reader, not the instruction of the farmer. To pick out only one example, let me quote the following passage which I felt compelled to find fault with today. Quote, "In spring's the time for sowing beans, then too the crumbling furrows clover welcome you, and millet too receives her yearly care." Boy, poetry does not survive translation, does it? I'll leave you to conclude from this whether the crops mentioned are to be planted at the same time as each other, and whether in each case they're to be sown in spring. As I write, it's June, getting on for July now too, and I've seen people harvesting beans and sowing millet on the same day. To get back to our olive plantation, I saw 2 different methods of planting used here. In the first, taking sizable trees and lopping off the branches, cutting them back to a foot from the stem. Aegialus transplanted them complete with crown, pruning away the roots and leaving only the actual base, the part to which the roots are attached. This he placed in the hole with an application of manure, and not only earthed it in, but trod and stamped the soil down hard. He says that nothing gives such good results as this packing them down, as he calls it. What it does, of course, is to keep out cold and wind, and apart from that, the tree is less liable to be shifted, thus allowing the young roots to sprout and get a grip on the soil when they are inevitably tender and torn from their precarious holds by the slightest disturbance. He also scrapes the crown of the tree before covering it up, because, he says, new roots emerge wherever the wood underneath has been laid bare. The tree again should not stand higher than 3 or 4 feet above the ground. This will ensure, right from the start, green growth from the bottom upwards, instead of a large area of dry and withered stem of the sort one sees in old olive groves. The second method was as follows. Taking branches of the type one normally finds on very young trees, strong but at the same time having soft bark, he planted them out in the same sort of way. These grow rather more slowly, but since they spring from what is virtually a cutting, there is nothing scraggy or unsightly about them. Another thing I've seen is the transplanting of an old vine from its supporting tree. In this case, one has to gather up with it, if possible, even the minute root hairs, and in addition give it a more generous covering of soil so that it throws out roots from the stem as well. I have seen such plantings not only in the month of February, but even at the end of March, the vines going on to embrace and take good hold of their new elm trees. Aegialus also says that all trees which are stout in the stem, if one may so term them, should have the benefit of a supply of water stored in tanks. If this is a success, we have brought the rain under our control. But I don't propose to tell you any more, in case I turn you into a rival grower in the same way as Aegialus has turned me into a competitor of his. Letter LXXX. So that's 85, 6, 7, 8. So 88. Letter 88. You want to know my attitude towards liberal studies? Well, I have no respect for any study whatsoever if its end is the making of money. Woohoo! Oh, really? Let me have a sip of coffee. This might be a spicy letter. Well, I have no respect for any study whatsoever if its end is the making of money. Such studies are to me unworthy ones. They involve the putting out of skills to hire, and are only of value insofar as they may develop the mind without occupying it for long. Time should be spent on them only so long as one's mental abilities are not up to dealing with higher things. They are our apprenticeship, not our real work. Why liberal studies are so called is obvious. It is because they are the ones considered worthy of a free man. But there is really only one liberal study that deserves the name because it makes a person free, and that is the pursuit of wisdom. Its high ideals, its steadfastness and spirit make all other studies puerile and puny in comparison. Do you really think that there's anything to be said for the others when you find among the people who profess to teach them quite the most reprehensible and worthless characters you could have as teachers? All right to have studied that sort of thing once, but not to be studying them now. The question has sometimes been posed whether these liberal studies make a man a better person, but in fact they do not aspire to any knowledge of how to do this, let alone claim to do it. Literary scholarship concerns itself with research into language, or history if a rather broader field is preferred, or, extending its range to the very limit, poetry. Which of these paves the way to virtue? Attentiveness to words, analysis of syllables, accounts of myths, laying down the principles of prosody. What is there in all this that dispels fear, roots out desire, or reins in passion? Or let us look at music, at geometry. You will not find anything in them which tells us not to be afraid of this or desire that, and if anyone lacks this kind of knowledge, all his other knowledge is valueless to him. The question is whether or not that sort of scholar is teaching virtue, for if he is not, he will not even be imparting it incidentally. If he is teaching it, he is a philosopher. If you really want to know how far these persons are from the position of being moral teachers, observe the absence of connection between all the things they study. If they were teaching one and the same thing, a connection would be evident, unless perhaps they managed to persuade you that Homer was actually a philosopher, though they refute their case by means of the very passages which lead them to infer it. For at one moment they make him a Stoic, giving nothing but virtue his approval, steering clear of pleasure, not even an offer of immortality inducing him to stoop to the dishonorable. At another they make him an Epicurean, praising the way of life of a society passing its days at peace and ease, in an atmosphere of dinner parties and music-making. At another he becomes a peripatetic, with a threefold classification of things good. At another, an academic, stating that nothing is certain. It is obvious that none of these philosophies is to be found in Homer for the very reason that they all are, the doctrines being mutually incompatible. Even suppose we grant these people that Homer was a philosopher, he became a wise man, surely, before he could recite any epics. So that what we should be learning are the things which made him wise. And there is no more point in my investigating which was the earlier, Homer or Hesiod, than there would be in my knowing the reason why Hecuba, though younger than Helen, carried her years so unsuccessfully. And what, I would ask this kind of scholar, do you suppose is the point of trying to establish the ages of Patroclus and Achilles? Are you more concerned to find out where Ulysses' wanderings took him, than to find a way of putting an end to our own perpetual wanderings? We haven't the time to spare to hear whether it was between Italy and Sicily that he ran into a storm, or somewhere outside the area of the world we know. Wanderings as extensive as his could never in fact have taken place inside so limited an area. When every day we're running into our own storms, spiritual storms, and driven by vice into all the troubles that Ulysses ever knew, we're not spared those eye-distracting beauties or attackers. We too have to contend in various places with savage monsters reveling in human blood, insidious voices that beguile our ears, shipwrecks and all manner of misfortune. What you should be teaching me is how I may attain such a love for my country, my father, and my wife, and keep on course for those ideals even after shipwreck. Why go into the question whether or not Penelope completely took in her contemporaries and was far from being a model of wifely purity, any more than the question whether or not she had a feeling that the man she was looking at was Ulysses before she actually knew it? Teach me instead what purity is, how much value there is in it, whether it lies in the body or the mind. Turning to the musical scholar, I say this: you teach me how bass and treble harmonize, or how strings producing different notes can give rise to concord. I would rather you brought about some harmony in my mind, and got my thoughts into tune. You show me which are the plaintive keys. I would rather you showed me how to avoid uttering plaintive notes when things go against me in life. The geometrician teaches me how to work out the size of my estates, rather than how to work out how much a man needs in order to have enough. He teaches me to calculate, putting my fingers into the service of avarice instead of teaching me that there is no point whatsoever in that sort of computation, and that a person is none the happier for having properties which tire accountants out. Or to put it another way, how superfluous a man's possessions are when he would be a picture of misery if you forced him to start counting up single-handed how much he possessed. What use is it to me to be able to divide a piece of land into equal areas if I'm unable to divide it with a brother? What use is the ability to measure out a portion of an acre with an accuracy extending even to the bits which elude the measuring rod if I'm upset? If I'm upset when some high-handed neighbor encroaches slightly on my property. The geometrician teaches me how I may avoid losing any fraction of my estates, but what I really want to learn is how to lose the lot and still keep smiling. Quote, But I'm being turned off the land my father and grandfather owned before me. Well, so what? Who owned the land before your grandfather? Are you in a position to identify the community, let alone the individual to whom it originally belonged? You entered on it as a tenant, not an absolute owner. Whose tenant, you may ask? Your heirs. And that only if you're lucky. The legal experts say that acquisition by prescription never applies where the property concerned is actually public property. Boo. Okay, we've hit our limit. I've got to call it for today. I've got to get to a meeting. Hope you guys enjoyed this reading, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.